Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Day the Internet Broke, Lessons from Recent Cloud Provider Outages. My name is Ivor Jenick, and I'm the Commercial Manager for CSC Digital Brand Services in Australia and New Zealand, and today I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to make a few announcements. Throughout the duration of our session, you can enter your questions and comments in the Questions and Answers widget. We'll take the time to answer your questions in a Q&A session with our speakers at the end of the presentation. And if you experience any technical difficulties, we're happy to help you troubleshoot the problem you're experiencing. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. In the Resource widget, you'll find a few resources on domain security, as well as a link to the Digital Brand Insider blog. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. Joining us today are Mike Hicks, Alban Kwon, and Jay Seo. Mike is the Principal Solution Analyst at Cisco ThousandEyes. He has over 30 years of experience providing support to complex networks throughout Europe, North America, Asia, and Australia, and in the area of application profiling and network performance management. Mike is also the author of Managing Distributed Applications, Troubleshooting in a Heterogeneous Environment, and Optimizing Applications on Cisco Networks, as well as multiple white papers on the subject of application delivery and network optimization. Alban is CSC's Regional Director for East Asia, based in our Hong Kong office. He's been with the Digital Brand Services business and affiliated companies since 2009, and leads the team responsible for all key accounts within the China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan markets. Based in Singapore, Jace is the APAC Regional Director of CSC with over 14 years of industry experience. She spearheaded the APAC Enterprise Account Management team in Oceania and has continued its regional expansion. And today, she will be our panel facilitator. And with that, let me hand over the time to Jace.
Thank you very much, Ivor, and good morning to everyone. It's a little bit gloomy here in Singapore. I hope it's sunnier for you out there. Before I begin and ramble on, I need to let you know something very important. I love questions because today is going to be an interactive and engaging session. So the Q&A widget is your best friend. Please punch in questions whenever there's something that piques your interest, and I'll try to pick them up and quiz our panelists today, namely Mike and Alban. Before we also begin, I'd like to highlight that we have a really nice audience with diverse backgrounds. So interestingly, it's not just IT leaders or security leaders who are attending today's session. We also have leaders from marketing, risk, and legal professionals joining us. So it goes to say that I think the DNS topic is quite an important one and might have very relevant business impact to different stakeholders within the company. So as you can see, I'm going to really talk through with our panelists today on a number of areas, but really surrounding the recent outages by cloud providers. So, we will talk about a few themes such as what happened, especially in June this year, what is the root cause of the problem, and what we can do about it. So you might have read over the news that there have been outages by cloud providers in the past months to past year. I'm going to just put a lens view of today's, for today's discussion on the June event, because there's been quite a few things that's happening during then. So as you can see with the timeline over here, in June or early June, Fastly CDN suffered a major internet outage, and that was caused by what they call the zero-day bug. In mid-June, Akamai DDoS protection reportedly caused another worldwide outage. And then in the week following that, on 23rd June, we have a major outage caused by Akamai's DNS. And this is kind of the crux of today's discussion, because this is what the experts coined as the day the internet broke, because people who are using Akamai for cloud services seem to be impacted in varying degrees, some for as long as over an hour's worth of downtime. So, of course, leading that, from that on, there were a lot of industry, experts and discussions around what really happened out there and what we can do about it. So likewise for CSC and ThousandEyes, we have also put in some thought pieces over here. You can see Alban Kwon over here. He wrote some important pieces about DNS, talk about why is it always in the DNS and the risk associated to it. In the second article about the deeper root cause of the problem with CDN providers, he also mentioned about the message about decoupling, meaning decoupling your DNS from your CDN infrastructure. This is probably a concept you might have heard or just haven't peeled the layers, so maybe we can probe that later with Alvin. And of course, ThousandEyes has done a lot of analysis about the recent outages, and they have also published thought pieces and blog posts and even video posts about that to talk about the what happened in there. So with that, right, I'm going to invite Mike to maybe give us some insight from his perspective, what happened in there and what he can share with the audience. So I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Jace. Yeah, so it's interesting watching those outages when you go through that timeline. Unfortunately, June seems to be a big month for us, didn't it? And impacting in varying degrees. What I want to do to start with is kind of just take us back a little bit into why are we having these problems. And if we actually take a consideration of what we got from the modern application today or the internet architecture we got today, the first thing is that obviously we've moved to a hybrid type of environment there. But even before that, we were starting to see people jump on and use the internet as their backbone. Right? So this then became their new network as what they were doing it. So the internet is the network backbone when it comes from there. But it's not just a simple case of putting stuff into rail and coming across from there. When we actually have to make this connection, as we'll get into from a DNS perspective, but also there's various components that have to be put together for us to be able to get to, when we press our enter on our key, to be able to then to see everything pop up on the screen for us as we expect it to be in the browser in a timely fashion, so we can execute our work, so we can watch our movies, so we can send tweets out. These have got to be sort of in real time. And there's an awful lot of components that take place. So first of all, we have to resolve the name. Then to make sure that speeds around from there, we have these CDNs regionally around there distributed. Our applications are split across microservices, so they'll be distributed in different cloud providers around from there. We then, unfortunately, got a lot of nefarious activity. So we're going to have this situation where we want to have protection, especially we talk about some of our financial apps. So we're going to have sort of DDoS security around from there. You still got this hybrid deployment scale going on from a data center. So we'll have some in the cloud, some in data centers, even if they're in hosted data centers. So you start to see all this complex build up. Now, what I got on the screen there from that view, that's one connection. So that's a group of users connecting through. If we imagine if we actually put that up for everybody, we've got all these interconnecting networks that come around from there. We've got distributed clouds. We have everything around there. We've got people trying to make the best use of their bandwidth to sit around from there. All of these cogs have got to work together for us to be able to achieve a good performance. And this is what happens when it breaks. One of those cogs fails, and because they're all intertwined and connected through there, this is when we start to get those failures. So those three failures you had across there were all caused by essentially different causes around from there. You talked about the bug in the 0-day bug we had from there, the software bug. For the fasted one, that was different to the fact that we had a DNS issue, the fact that we had some sort of a routing table mitigation, but they all had the same result in as much as they were a single part of that delivery chain that broke that then caused disruption to the users. And because everything's distributed and because we're relying on third parties and things that are there, it might have even been your front line that was actually failing. So it might have been some sort of back-end service that actually was impacted, but then you as a brand were blamed because that actually caused the outage to come across from there. So that's really just sort of covering the background from there. And I think before I just rabbit and take all the time, I'll flip that back to you to to take the questions.
Thank you, Mike. So let me just push this slide. Okay. Thank you. So thank you for explaining, the events that happen and the interconnectivity between applications. It looks like you've seen a number of outages that appear to impact the internet community or connectivity over the past couple of months, right? Can this be attributed to a single common cause?
No, not really. There's all different ones. So what they all have in common is the impact to the users. The users get disgruntled, everyone's out from there. But really, each one of those had a different cause. So one was a CDN failure. So when you couldn't get to the CDN at all from there. Another one was actually a routing failure. So the paths effectively were all sort of terminated into a black hole. So you couldn't physically get to the destination that you needed to get to for the network. And then the other one was a DNS failure. So there was an issue with the DNS. So you failed in that first hurdle. You could not resolve the names to therefore get an IP address to actually get to your destination. So there's all different things around there. As I was saying, because of everything that's mixed with those complexities coming together, this is where we've effectively got, it's not quite a whole bunch of single point of failures, but it's a collection of single point of failures. That makes sense. If we get a failure in a major system of that, it can actually have that dramatic effect. So it's a really long answer to, there wasn't one common cause, there was all lots of causes, but they were all involved in that setting up and that connectivity aspect.
Thank you. So, Alban, you have mentioned quite a bit on the DNS, right? In your article, it's always in the DNS. I think it's very related to the previous point that Mike has mentioned. Why would you say that, and why would DNS be an important consideration?
Yeah, I think DNS is something that people sometimes neglected in a way, because it's been using DNS for whatever years, 20 odd years, and normally DNS just works. It is a simple, basic protocol that always just works. So sooner or later, people are starting to forget about it. But having said that, there's also, this is a saying that not made up by me, it's a saying in the IT community that people are saying that if there's an internal network issue, normally it's just DNS because something is not connecting to something else. But I think what we, when we are saying this particular thing about it's always DNS, is we talk about something a bit more external as well. Just to get back to your previous question as well, although if you look into all these three cases, there's no common cause per se, as Mike mentioned, but there is also a commonality among them. It's because these are all happening external to the network. As well, right? So these things that happen external impact your availability of your services to the public, or even maybe within your organization as well. Because when the CDN book, maybe some of your authentication, some of your internal networking also won't work as well. So I think this is something that I want to highlight in that particular article, which is a concept called network. Cybersecurity, there's a network component and there's an inter-network component to it. So within your internal network, within your firewall, certainly you have to invest to protect. But outside your firewall, within the internet itself, in the internet RAM, you have to also pay attention to it, because if that part blocks, it blocks your internal network, and it can impact your services as well. So I think when we talk about it's always DNS, that's the kind of the concept behind it. And if you think about all the things that DNS connected to, it's not only your website, it's also your email, your VPN, your Office 360 authentication, your Google authentication, your DMARC record, basically your connection to the cloud, which is something that we'll talk about in more details later on. Everything is connected through the DNS now, so that's a very important aspect of it.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think you made a really good point there about the external. So these things are critical to your business, right? But you have no control over them. So you're at their whim, as it were. A failure out from there has a dramatic impact to your business. We talked about those outages there. One of those outages, and it depends on the time of day and so on from cost from there. But from down here, we had situations where people were leaving, had to leave the grocery stores because they couldn't do the payment. Now, this wasn't the problem this wasn't caused by any issues within the grocery store themselves. This was an external issue to them. but it was their brand that was impacted. People didn't then say, oh, it was this third party who was causing the problem. It was, or caused me my problem that day. It all came down to the fact that, oh, this particular grocery store couldn't process my payment. I'm not going to use them again. I don't know if anybody went to that stage, but you know, the anger was outpouring at them. And this is critical, because as we started to come to the internet controlling us, and you know, I'm going to touch on your DNS point there as well, is that we expanded and say it's a network, and people forget that to connect to the network, you have to that DNS connectivity. It's critically important. It's a foundational step. But without that, when we're now relying on the internet to drive our businesses to our everyday lives, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you don't have any control over. But what you need to be is to be aware of it's out there and be aware of what it's doing, so that you can start to take mitigation or take steps to sort of work around problems should they occur, to reduce the impact on your business itself.
Excellent. I was trying to weigh in on that one too. I'm going to get back to the point on, what can we, I really like how you're sharing this, because it goes to show that a lot of things that we're doing, when we talk about DNS, it might seem like a technical owner's question or problem, but actually it's got business impact, right? The marketing professionals wouldn't want people to ditch their cart from this grocery store because they're going to the competition site because they couldn't check out. So there's really a lot of implications on this. But actually, it was something that I wanted to ask a bit later. Maybe it's just worth asking now. Maybe I'll ask you first, and Mike, have you seen situations where technical stakeholders are working closely with business owners in evaluating their internet infrastructure, for instance, or in cases like these, how can they make sure that they don't have customers, they're switching, loyalty at a particular moment because of a connectivity issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good question. Everything's stripped around now, or we're starting to see this change now, where the business owners themselves are they're not going to IT and saying we've got a problem, or throwing something over the wall, or saying what's going across there. They're taking active interest, to the point where some organisation working with are starting to tie business bonuses and KPI to a shared responsibility to deliver the application. And once you get into that shared responsibility, they're obviously not going to be the ones to fix it, but they want to be aware of what's going on. And once they're aware of all these different components across there, they've also then started to drive, it's not just a set and leave. What can we do to, make sure this type of thing doesn't happen again? And then they start to get in the planning process. So they start to say things like we're talking about decoupling aspects from it. How far do we want to go from a diversification aspect? Do we want multiple CDNs out there, providers? Do we need multiple DDoS protection types of things from there? We're starting to get involved in those discussions, but it becomes a joint discussion. So IT is starting to be less of, they're starting to have more of an impact on the business, I should say. And because of that, they can actually start to become more of a profit center. And then the whole business is getting involved in what can we do to drive it forward. So we're not just looking at what's the status quo. How can we move to a continuous improvement model? Because even there's one aspect of when we have a fault, but we picked out 3 faults in June there, and June was probably a horrible month. But traditionally we'll go along quite happily there. So you can't stick around at that time, same type of speed. And I think I said we were talking before is that when I'm very old. When I came in the industry, we were talking about 8 seconds. If people were on a website for 8 seconds, they'd abandon it. That's now down. If you look at the analysts, they talk about 3 seconds. So, and then, it's like the 100-meter record is getting faster and faster. We have to different degrees we want to go to. And that's the same for your delivery. We want to make sure, what can we do to optimize it? So we're not, and this is where the business owners come in, and I'm getting back to that point, is that the business owners, the marketing professionals are saying, what can we do to improve performance? And then this is when that collaborative stuff's coming in from there. We don't want to stand still, we want to move forward.
Very good point. Thank you. Alvin, you have anything to add from here as well?
Yeah, I just want to quickly mention that what might describe our ideal situation. I think in practice, we haven't seen that happen, at least in the Asian market as yet. And unfortunately, I think what we've seen is more of a siloed responsibility. Even within IT, it is, when we talk about DNS, picking the DNS provider is predominantly a IT infrastructure team responsibility. So, and basically they pick whatever that they can trust, but it's the lowest cost. By trust is basically, I don't think there's a whole lot of evaluation criteria either. So that's the current situation. I think what we observe in the not APAC, but at least in Asia region, that's what we see. But what you actually mentioned is very important, because when we look into how the customer is structured, a lot of them are actually relying heavily on the internet for the business already. Not only if they are like an e-commerce business, but even if they are like a more traditional business, they can't run the business without the internet. Especially when you consider some of the latest development that I mentioned, like email or the CDN connection. A lot of application relies on that. But I think business perspective or legal perspective, these kind of things are not adding to the consideration as yet, because I don't think we understand the whole scope of impact of a DNS outage could have.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, you're right. It is a nice where we're going to get to at that point there, and it's this. And the thing you've mentioned there, the silos, you see that, which also then leads to this finger pointing. So what's the impact of it? It wasn't me, it was you. And also the trouble with looking at things in silos is also that silo will be performing really well. We have these issues, obviously, with the external where we had a bug failure or where the routing table disappeared from that, but which are not obvious, but they're there. You can see what happened from those. But it's also these subtle degradations which have the same impact. Any one part of that starts to slow down. And if I'm looking at from the DNS perspective, say, or I'm just looking at from the network delivery perspective, or even from the application perspective, all my lights are green. It's only when I put everything together that I see there's a problem. And this is then where those guys are critical. This is where the marketing people become critical. They can say, well, actually, that's not good. It's this is then where we have this issue, because my brand's now being damaged. And this is then where they want to be able, or should start to come in to say, what's the cause of that problem? But you can only get that if you look at that holistically. Sorry, Jace, I saw you going to ask a question. I talked over the top.
No, go ahead. I might be nodding to myself. But thank you. A good question I kind of wanted to ask is from probably from the audience, right? The recent events, as we've seen a lot of companies, maybe from the Western region, being impacted. Here we're in the Asia Pacific region. We don't seem to see a lot of that, right? Do you feel that the APAC community is more immune from such outages or dependencies or not? This is really for both of you.
So I'll jump in first, Alvin, there, but we're certainly not immune down here in this region. All right? So no one's immune. There will be outages all the time. This is a fact of life. Death, taxes, there'll be outages on the internet around from there. It's what the impact it has around from there. What we do see, from ThousandEyes perspective, when we start to see it, is we can see patterns in terms of sort of time of day outages. So the impact it's going to have is obviously if it's going to impact you during your or our business hours down from there. And then what we've seen is it really depends on if an outage occurs because it's a problem or it's been caused because something has touched something. Generally, it's been done through some sort of maintenance window that's going on from there. And then depending on how that provider is actually structured or providing that service is structured, remember we're talking about these third-party areas there, they may choose to do that within their maintenance or their out-of-business hours window, which is directly opposite to us down here in APAC. So what we sometimes see is we'll get the flow-on effect from a planned maintenance outage that is going to have some disruptive impact from there, and it comes down and impacts us during the business hours because it's been done sort of out of our hours there. But then if we get the other ones where we have traditional outage or something occurs, something breaks that we didn't know about, or a third party comes in from there, we're certainly not immune down from here. But it then depends on how the infrastructure is set up, how people are connected, what levels they've gone to mitigate those types of scenarios. How far have they gone? Have they backed up to back up from there? And it's also where their customers are being served from. So where is my customer, where's my population base, my users actually located around from there? because again, they might be hitting or be able to access a part of that delivery chain which isn't impacted by the outage because they're very local to it. It's only impacting a subset of CDNs, and we can actually flick something across from there. Or they've already moved to a DNS, the type of outage from there. So I guess, again, my long answer to, we're not immune down here. We might see less because of the timing they're done at, and also we might see some impact us greater than they impact other regions because, again, of the timing they actually occur from there. But then it also comes down to how their customers are based. And there's really, what I'm leading to with all of this is what you need to do from an organisation is you need to be able to understand how and where your service is delivered, what paths they actually take to get somewhere from there. And then so I can actually plan. So I'm actually starting to come from a level of knowing, so I can say, if I get this situation occurring, what's the risk to me, for example, if I've got my DNS, my CDN coupled together, and it goes down. Right? I'm using the same supplier from there, I haven't decoupled things, and have an impact to me. Well, none of my users can actually get to me because they can no longer they can't connect to my name server. They can't find us. So it doesn't matter if my CDN is up. They just physically can't connect to me at all, so they can't get to us. So that might be a simple step as I'm going to decouple that. So then, all right, so the risk is now I've got two effectively points of failure. But what I now have is that I can now work around this situation. So if I get a failure in one, so if I get a failure in my CDN, I might be able to flip stuff back to my origin server. So I can actually divert traffic back from there. If I get a failure in my DNS and I don't have diverse DNS providers, which is actually always a good idea, as well as decoupling, I can actually re-advertise my IP address out from into a different a DNS. So I kind of change it. So I can sort of get it advertised out slightly different. So again, really long answer to, no, we're not immune. There's steps we can actually take to do this, but it's just a set of circumstances going to impact us.
Yeah. So, Alvin, I'm going to flick it to you because I know you're going to weigh in, but I think this is a really nice time for you to talk about what you mean by decoupling so that the audience can understand the perspective and why, because leading on from what Mike said, decoupling is not just a solution, but you are also decoupling your points of failure, which is a very good point to make. So over to you.
Yeah. So one quick feedback on the previous question first. I think there's I have an observation in the APAC market is that people tend to think that they're immune, but I think this is a very interesting idea because I think it might be true like a couple of years ago or 10 years ago, because if I'm an attacker, I would target someone who gives me the highest return on investment. So they might target the larger global provider, which are predominantly based in the US, I think, at that time. So you will see the Equifax or, other large-scale, well-known brand being reported in the news. And sometimes we may think that, in the region, we're too small for these hackers to be targeting me. But certainly, I think there are two trends that may impact is, first of all, the trends that Mike already mentioned about, when we are using all these global providers, when they're impacted, we are impacted, and, they are, if there's a human error that needs to happen, it might be, there's might be a higher possibility that it happens in the APAC time zone, because of the maintenance windows and stuff like that. The second thing is that there's also the crowding out effect as well. When people are investing millions of dollars to protect themselves, the hackers are naturally going to target less protected people. So, and it might happen that there are more people who have not been investing in this kind of security before, or haven't been paying attention to the things that we talk about today, than in the Europe or US counterpart. Then maybe we are more vulnerable because people will be seeking us out. So getting to Jay's questions about decoupling. So thank you for the questions. So this is something that I have to credit ThousandEyes research as well, because I get quite a fair bit of the idea from their research. So I think there's a problem that we need to address nowadays, and that problem is precisely what being shown in the screen on the slide. If you look into how it's being structured now, people are using a lot of providers to make the internet works, and there's this internet consolidation happening, and this consolidation happens all over the place, but especially on the side where the network happened, the internet network happens on the connection side. This is hypercritical for you because if that any part failed, everything basically failed. Now, in one of the research in ThousandEyes, they mentioned that in some of the incident before, when one provider went down, other larger providers seems to went down as well. So we can see this kind of horizontal integration happening as well. So although I'm just, for example, I'm not saying any provider are worse than anyone. Just for example, AWS went down, it might impact other people as well. So if I'm using party B, a provider B, I think they are good, but actually you're not immune because everything behind the scene are highly integrated. So that's one of the critical points, because when we think that moving to cloud gives me safety, it's actually exposed me to other kind of risks that I don't see and I haven't really evaluated before. Even if I evaluate my provider, it doesn't give me exposure to that particular risk. So the idea then about decoupling is about how do you actually build disaster recovery. If I presume that there's a matter of fact that my cloud provider will went down one day, if I accept this as a matter of fact, then what I need to do is to ensure that when it went down, I have a way to recover. So by decoupling the DNS away from the cloud, it gives you the disaster recovery capability, because DNS work one layer below or above, depending on how you want to say that. So it is more fundamental to the CDN in some way. So it starts with DNS and then it connects to your cloud services. So if you decouple that, then and run that on a separate network, it gives you the flexibility. If anything happened on the CDN side went down, then you can IP file over to something else. If you have double CDN, then you can route things to the other CDN. If you don't have one, then you can route things to your original servers as well. So it's really about architecting the network with the assumption that your CDN will eventually go down.
Yeah, thank you. You touched a very good note there on redundancy or the disaster recovery. So, Mike, I'm not sure what you have anything to weigh in from Alvin's point of view, but my next point is why should DNS be considered in any redundancy planning in this case?
Well, I'll do both to weigh in. So it's a very good point you made there, Aaron, but it's because it's a fundamental part, right? So if I'm going to make my systems redundant, and I'm actually going to do my main foundational part, I'm not going to make my main foundation part. It doesn't matter how much backup I've got in the background, how much redundant CDNs, or whatever I've got, I can go to the nth degree. I physically can't resolve that name to start with. I cannot make a connection. I can't connect to my cloud services. I can't go directly to a local CDN. I can't come back to the origin. And more importantly, if you think about some of the failures that occurred and how people mitigated around it, a lot of it was they actually used the DNS to re-advertise themselves out of a different network, so they could then sort of work around where these faults were resolved. So it's very important. But to your point then of how far do I go, and it comes back to this: what risks am I actually taking? How long can I be out for? And then you've got to look at, as I said, it was a very good point. I like the way you picked up the nefarious people, and I was just going for the maintenance windows. But what's it going to mean to my business? What's the impact to my business? So where are my user populations? If I'm a bricks and mortar type of place, and I'm actually relying on a back-end connection to the internet to do my payment processing for my pay and go, then I'm actually using internet. I'm using global providers to actually provide that for me. Can I afford to have any outage down from there? Probably the answer is no for those guys. So they then have to take into place right there. Almost certainly, I would always put in redundant DNS servers or systems in place from there. And then they're going to go, so do we want to have multiple CDNs across them there, or it's actually not serving our type of data. It comes on the type of business they're doing. And it's really, like I said, this is where that baseline, that benchmarking comes in. And you want to understand this is how our system works. And then you get the technical people say, well, if there's a failure here, then we're going to lose the entire payment processing system, right? And that impacts our business, impacts our bottom line, affects us doing that way there. So therefore, we need to protect that. So it's coming back from there. But if you want to go to the other way, for example, let's say we've got a DDoS mitigation system in place there. Do I want to have a redundant system that sits on in a standby situation from there? And probably the answer is, I mean, yes, you could do it. It's technically difficult to do, but you could probably achieve something there. But it's probably not worth doing, because there's steps I can take down there. So example, like we said, if I can actually re-advertise myself under one of my DNS providers to actually re-advertise my network. So I'm coming from there. I can change my prefixes. I'm advertised slightly differently, again, to appear as a different network. There's things I can do. So you have to look at what's the impact compared with the cost it's actually going to do to deliver for me there. And then the other thing to there is we're not just planning from redundancy from a failure point of view. We do talk about disaster recovery, but what can we do? What actually helps us going forward? So obviously we've got the risk of actually losing money from our business point of view, but can we actually, by diversifying, by splitting, have multiple CDNs, will that actually provide us with a better delivery? Because my customers are globally distributed. If I go with 2 CDNs, these ones are better operators out of this region compared to these ones here. So now I'm actually splitting it. I could then use, I could probably use DNS service to do my load balancing between them, and I start to get those types of ways there. So it's the redundancy plays a part for not just stopping us from an impacting an outage perspective, but also how can we optimize our business? How can we take it forward? How can we better serve our customers, improve our digital experience? So yeah, it's all combined in there.
Yeah. So Alvin, I think on the concept of decoupling, and thanks Mike for that, leading on to that, right? When we chatted, you mentioned about kind of maybe 2 types of decoupling. One is horizontally, where you use multiple CDN providers, you use multiple enterprise providers. So I was thinking, who does that, right? It's a lot of money, a lot of resources. So there's another one more practical way that you talk about, which is maybe the vertical decoupling, where you decouple your DNS from your CDN provider, meaning you don't just use your CDN provider for DNS only. Can you talk through maybe more on this practical scenario? What does it entail, and what does the ideal scenario look like if I could have my way?
Sure. I think, we all know the most ideal situation, the perfect situation is that everything have redundancy and your redundancy have redundancy, but the list will not stop. And then the problem is always just budget. We have limited resources. How do we optimize the network in a way that it gives me the highest level of safety? And I think when I look into the when you have multiple CDN, one of the problem that I still can't get my head around is how these people are integrated together already. So even if I have 2 CDNs, for example, how do I know that behind the scene they're not interrelated as well? Because you don't know. There's no research that can give you that information. I think some of the research from ThousandEyes, when you guys do outages analysis, you find some of these kind of linkages. But commercially, how can I know? So certainly, when you do the horizontal diversification, you have to consider whether they are truly independent, or are they also in the link already. And that's one of the hurdles that you run into. And the second hurdle is basically just money, because especially when I talk to some of the Asia-based businesses, a lot of them have just migrated to one particular cloud providers not long ago. And if you tell them to double the cost and move to another one, that would be impractical to do. So if you and one of the things that you have, I think why I advocate, you maybe have to first consider vertical separation is because of these 2 particular factor. So if you, let's just say that if you separate your DNS from your CDN, and certainly from your original host, you should have a separation as well. All the DDoS provider that you use, maybe it's a good idea not to be using the same one. If you consider this, then you don't really pay too much money because you're already paying for all this. You just separate the payment to different vendors. So there might be a little bit less economy of scale, but it's still a lot better than buying two separate services per level. And also, regarding the separation regarding DNS, I have to go back to Mike's point as well. It's the most foundational layer of everything. So if you don't secure that layer, if you don't make sure that that layer is always on, then everything subsequent to that would be a problem, because anything happen afterwards, you can fix it with your DNS. You can route it to whatever you want, and that's why you have to separate it out to ensure that when your CDN when one of the cloud provider went down, I'm not saying CDN because it can happen in a number of different ways. Any of the cloud services went down. If your DNS is also within that cloud, then you lose your mitigation. So that's I think the case for vertical separation.
Thank you, Alban. Just a quick time check. We have 5 minutes to wrap. So just a reminder for the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to type into the Q&A widget, and I will try to pick it up very quickly. So leading on to what you mentioned, Alban, about the vertical decoupling, which is probably the more practical way. In doing so, right, in your opinion, what would be then the ideal type of DNS provider someone should be considering in this part of redundancy program?
Okay. So one of the things that I can't say is that, when you put a DNS provider, for example, the one that we partner with, there won't be any probability of outage, because I think that's not the right thing to say. Although there's a 100% SLA, uptime SLA or something like that, it doesn't mean there won't be any human error possibility. So when we pick the DNS provider, from CSP's perspective, we basically don't provide our own DNS. We pick a provider on behalf of our customer, basically. So when we do the evaluation, we base it upon a couple of criteria. First of all, we look into the chance of human errors. How do I minimize human errors? One of the things that we come up with is that, how important is that business for this particular vendor? Is that like a side business for them, or is it the main business? If it is the main business, they naturally they be a lot more careful about changing anything in the software. The other criteria we will look into is the experience. Do they have like registry level experience? Because I think when it comes to DNS or the whole domain name architecture, the registry are the one who are most experienced, and they look into the DNS in a different perspective as well. So registry experience is another thing that we will look into. Another thing is whether this is a separate network. As we mentioned about all this, separation, diversification discussion. If the DNS network is also part of some other network, then although you use another vendor, it doesn't really help you as well. So we want to make sure that when we pick a DNS network, that network is separate. It's not used by any other type of services. It's purely built for DNS and DNS only. And I think these three are very important points when you actually pick a DNS provider. On top, there's an interesting aspect, the fourth one, which is quite interesting. Actually, when I talk to one of the a customer in Hong Kong, we bring up this particular point which I have never thought about before. So some of the errors that we see in June are software updates error. So we talk about software having a undiscovered vulnerability or bug. So how do you prevent that? So a lot of the DNS service use a software called Bind. So if you're looking into a secondary provider, maybe it's a good idea to pick someone who is not using Bind. So if Bind itself have a vulnerability not discovered but discovered by a hacker, at least if you're using different software, then it can help you to mitigate as well. So that's another consideration. So there are a couple other considerations. I won't detail it here, but I think these are the key consideration when we pick a provider that can minimize some of the human errors or risk that we talk about today.
Thank you, Alban. Mike, do you have any advice on choosing DNS provider from your perspective?
No, it was very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess all I add is echo what Alban's saying there, but also then from a practical perspective is as much as you can do is understanding. You said sort of how many outages they have, how many frequency they have, which basically all plays into what Alban was saying there. But if you could quantify that in some way and actually understand how they perform in that region, how they perform from that area, and you just said, and I really like the one about the different ones using Bind. Actually, I haven't considered that. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, but that's really it. It's taking everything you said from there and looking at it from a practical, a tangible sense. Can we see if they have outages, what's the duration of the outages? How long are they between the outages from a frequency perspective? Taking that data so we can say, yeah, for us in this region, and bear in mind, that might not be for the whole globe. That might just be for where you actually serve from in your area, your region. Different ones are going to have say relevant to yourself.
Yeah, so one thing I want to point out as well, that's actually related to IP failover functionality. I think a lot of people that I talk to, they tend to do IP failover on a hardware level. And I think if you're using a really great DNS, then I think a good idea to maybe consider doing the IP failover or do the load balancing on the DNS level as well, because after all, this is the first layer that you encounter, and that pays really well into what we discussed about. So if you have the IP failover and load balancing on the DNS level, anything subsequent to DNS failed, then you can easily fail over to whatever you want, and you save yourself the trouble of manually updating your A records or something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's always going to take time for that the new names propagate, but you're reducing the time you're actually out from that moment. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So one question. So I just have one quick question for Mike as well related to this. So when I talk to a lot of people in the Chinese market, they are worried about decoupling the CDN and the DNS because they are under the impression that these two cannot be decoupled. They have to use it together. Otherwise, something may not work. From a technical perspective, I just wonder whether you have anything that you want to add on that.
I mean, there's quite a few large organisations actually decouple that way, and actually exactly what you said there. They use their DNS as a load balancing, or they balance for the load. They do load balancing through the DNS services that are there for exactly the same reason, so they can do the IP failover from that one there. There's obviously the biggest thing about having them together is that propagation time when you actually make a change around from there. But there's nothing. Technically, I think it's a good idea to have those separated around from those areas there. And again, it comes down to your risk profile. If we got a local CDN provider, where everything across from there, their failure rates are really good. We can't get a better service from anybody else in those particular areas. Then absolutely we can have them together. So it's not I have to decouple them from that way there, but it's practically or technically there's no reason why you can't. And like you said, it affords you other options. It separates those two out so that I can do IP failovers. I can even, you start to then do things from a maintenance perspective. I want to now shift out. I want to pull things out of circulation, or I want to then start to shift around from a load balancing point of view. So I'm actually doing it around there. So I'm making use of, from an off-peak perspective, I'm making better use of the resources available to me by sort of shifting traffic around. And some of the larger providers will actually do that anyway. So if you actually look at your connection at one moment, because we're resolving to DNS, but it's forwarding me to a completely different CDN location to the next connection that should come through from there, from the same point. So I've gone off tangent there, but yeah, it's technically possible to do that. But really, it comes down to your risk profile is what makes sense to me. And in most cases, sort of decoupling, allowing it to do that, it makes the best technical sense.
So, gentlemen, this is a really good discussion. I'm afraid we're over time, so I'm going to wrap up by asking each of you to give maybe a final word of advice to our audience today. Maybe we could start with Alvin first. What do you have to say for our audience to take away?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is that when we think about network security, we have to think, or cybersecurity, we have to think about network security inside your firewall and outside your firewall. I think this is one of the things that is quite important in the internet age. As we move more and more to the internet and rely more and more on that, we have to remember that this is no longer a network play. It is an internetworking play, and when we think about internetwork, how it connects all together, it's really about DNS. It's really about the BGP protocol, DNS. Anything that help you connect with each other. This is a perspective that we have to consider. And if you think about it from this kind of perspective, then you understand how important DNS really is, because it's foundational to all the networking and internetworking. So and that's why you have to pay extra attention about this, and to really give it the credit of what it's doing for your business. Is connect everything for you, and you have to realize that if DNS failed, everything basically failed. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Very nice advice. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, again, so just echoing that, and the point that the internet is now your network. The cloud is your data center. The SaaS is effectively now your application stack. Right? This is the paradigm in which we live now. So across from there. There's things outside of your control that you now have to get visibility into. You don't necessarily need to have to control them or be able to configure those, but you have to be aware of what's going on from those side of things. And just really briefly touching on your security thing, we will take all the security measures around there, and you can put your ring fences up, and the secure edge and everything is fantastic. You also need to pay attention of how your traffic gets from point A to B, so understand the path. Are we going through a sort of a diverse way there? Maybe totally secure, maybe everything across there encapsulated, but how do we actually get from point A to point B? Do we go via E, F, and G, or are we actually going sort of just through C and D? It's really just an awareness of that complete service delivery chain. That'd be the main advice I'll take on.
That's great. I'm just going to ask one of you to answer a question, or final question that we have from the audience. This is from Nico. What do we mean by anycast and non-bind? Does it mean bind DNS? Maybe, Alvin, you want to have a go with this one?
Sure. So most DNS runs on a software called Bind. When we pick the provider, well, actually, some of the registry level providers, they don't use Bind. They develop their own proprietary DNS software. For example, VeriSign, the .com registry, they don't use Bind. They use their own one. Newstar, the one that we partner with now, they use a proprietary one as well. Depending on how you see it, it might be, security by obscurity, but there are also non-bind software out there. If you want to also reduce the risk of a open source software called like Bind, which is quite well known to have a lot bugs and updates that you have to do, then this might be something that you want to consider. I'm not trying to say bind is bad, but when you look into diversification on the software level to reduce this kind of zero-day bug, might be something that you can also consider as well.
Thank you very much for the nice answer. So this is how we're going to leave some takeaway for you. I will not be going through each point, but basically because there's no single cause to the problem, there's really no one-size-fits-all solution. Do treat DNS and domains as part of your critical infrastructure like electricity powering your house. So you need to make sure that you have proper redundancies for that. And we talk about decoupling. If you ever need to know more of these, please reach out to us so that we can explain, the practical solution that we talk about. And the last point was kind of the features that Alvin has talked about on what are possible features you might want to consider in your enterprise-grade DNS provision. So with that, thank you so much to Mike and Alvin for spending time with us today for a very interactive discussion. We are at time, unfortunately, but we will continue again. And I shall hand back to Ivor, but thank you so much, audience, for joining us as well. So I'll turn it over to Ivor to wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Jace. And thank you to everyone, our speakers today, for a great session. So for everyone in the audience, if you have a question that we didn't get to, we'll contact you with a response after the webinar. And finally, you should see on screen now a poll question of sorts. If you'd like to find out more about today's discussion or any of the topics that we covered, then please select an option on screen, and we'll make sure that someone gets in touch with you. And that's all we have time for today. So once again, thank you, Mike, and all our panelists for joining our session. Thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us today, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.